you very much, and good morning to everyone. It's delightful to be back here in Korea. I've been privileged to be a visitor to your country for the last 15 or so years, with many visits, most recently to come and participate in a joint teaching program that we have between MIT and SKK University, as indicated here. This has been an opportunity for me to both learn about your country, to enjoy teaching, and to see the benefits of the kind of international collaboration that this forum exhibits, and to see how we can all promote economic growth and improvements in standard of living through the education process. So I'm delighted to be part of this forum. I congratulate you for hosting such an ambitious activity as this, and for bringing together the rich array of people who have participated in the days preceding this closing session. I believe that the ideas that have been expressed and shared over the last couple of days provide a strong basis for moving forward in what I want to talk about here this morning. And that is this notion of realizing what some are beginning to call the Korean dream, of having a knowledge-based economy that combines both strong economic development with healthy families and thriving communities. So perhaps, if we can move this forward. Whoops. There we go. This idea of the Korean dream, expressed in this way as a mutually reinforcing relationship between a knowledge-based economy, healthy families, and thriving communities, emerged out of discussions with a group sponsored by the Korean Labor Institute and by the private sector called a New Paradigm Initiative, where leaders from business and leaders from education and leaders from government and leaders from the labor community have been working together to ask, how can we take what we know is so important about education, about lifelong learning, about the need to promote innovation in our business strategies and in our organizational processes, and make them work for our economy, for our families, and for our communities. And so the first task, I believe, of making progress in this area is to have a common vision, to really think hard about what it is that we want to achieve as we invest in education and as we move forward. And if we could work toward broadening this vision, building a broader sharing of this vision across all the leaders in your economy and in economies across the world, then I believe the goals and the aspirations of this global HR forum could be realized not only here in Korea but elsewhere. What does it take? Well, I want to talk briefly about what I see as the key requirements, starting obviously with a strong knowledge-based workforce, but then going to some of the issues that Professor Barrow talked about a few minutes ago. What are the institutions, particularly the workplace-based institutions and the community and regional economic development institutions needed to support a knowledge-based workforce and to move beyond? And so these are some of the issues that we'll talk about here briefly this morning. But let me start with what is one of my most favorite quotes that I've now just plagiarized and used, hopefully by giving appropriate citation to its author, in a number of things that I've written and places where I've spoken over the last several years. At a meeting, an international forum to celebrate Korea's success in moving beyond the financial and economic crisis that you experienced in 1997. In 2001, sponsored by the World Bank and the IMF and your government, President Kim Dae-jung used this phrase, and I think it captures the essence of our challenge for the workforce. In today's global world, all of our citizens, with an emphasis on everyone, must become the next generation intellectuals. That means that we have to go beyond the traditional notion of what is a knowledge worker to think about everyone in our workforce. And I want to give some examples of how we can move forward along those lines and some of the particular challenges that we face here in Korea in doing so. Because too often, in the rhetoric and in fact in our policies across the world, we have thought about the knowledge workforce as those elite workers. Yes, the engineers, the technicians, the scientists, the managers and executives who are so critical to any knowledge-based economy, but we have forgotten the fact that a knowledge-based economy requires education and engagement of all the people in our workforce. And I want to emphasize that point directly here this morning. How do we build a knowledge-based workforce? You've talked about this for 3 days, and I don't need to spend a great deal of time on it. But I want to emphasize 2 points about basic education. I agree that we are doing a better job in some cases, not in all. There's high variance in many of our private educational institutions at the basic and secondary levels. And that is the case here in Korea. I don't have to tell people in this audience how much you invest in supplementing the public education system for your children, in having after-school programs or the so-called cramming programs that are available to people with the means to pay for them. But that isn't going to be adequate for the vast majority of people who don't have those kinds of resources. And so we have to continue to invest in public education so that all young people have access to the same opportunities to move on to the higher levels of education necessary. But in addition, we face around the world, and perhaps particularly here in Korea, the challenge of adapting our education to fit the needs of a knowledge-based economy. Most of our educational models have been designed for an industrial economy. That is a fairly hierarchical organization, an organization where authority flows from the top, directions are given, and those in lower levels are expected to have the discipline and have the wherewithal to follow directions. Today's workforce, today's organizations, today's economy requires innovation, creativity, problem solving, conflict resolution skills, coordinating across different functions and organizations. And therefore our educational system and our modes of learning and our methods of teaching have to mirror those needs in our basic educational system. Requires that we have both deep science and mathematical skills, but the ability to use those skills in integrative activities, working in teams, solving problems, communicating with each other, and being able to develop the kind of behavioral skills that are required to work in an international setting. I've seen this most directly in our own teaching in the joint programs here, where we have been able to bring Koreans, other people from other parts of Asia, people from Eastern Europe together to learn from each other. And you can see the richness that develops in the mutual learning process when these kinds of interactive skills and group skills can combine with good technical skills. I know this is a challenge in changing the traditional modes of teaching here in Korea, but I believe it is a critical step for the next generation of graduates of your educational system. This will require a lot of work with your teachers. It will require a lot of parental involvement, and it will require a lot of involvement of people in the business and in industry today to provide the kind of support for modifying our educational systems. I don't need to go beyond what I think Professor Barrow mentioned. Yes, in the United States, our strongest asset is our universities, and both private and public universities. We have worked very hard to develop those, and I believe you are making tremendous progress here in Korea as well. I think that progress is accelerated by the kinds of joint programs that many of us participate in around the world. We learn from the United States and from our European counterparts when we join with you here in Korea, as we have done, or as we are doing in China and other regions, other countries in the region. And we benefit from these joint programs, but I can guarantee you that your Korean students who have been exposed to joint programs, who will come and visit and take a semester of courses at MIT, at Columbia, at Northwestern, at Harvard, and other sister universities, get an enormous amount from this international exchange. And so I think this is part of our challenge as well, to continue to expand and invest in these kinds of international linkages. Lifelong learning is an interesting term. It's in the political rhetoric around the world, particularly in my country, in the United States. Everyone wants to use that term, but very few people are willing to think hard and analytically about why we have limitations on lifelong learning. We have a very basic, long-standing, well-understood market failure. No individual firm has strong incentives to invest in general education to provide people the opportunity to be mobile on the external labor market if and when necessary. Yet those are the skills, continuing to build and broaden our education to keep up with changes in technology, to be able to move to where the job opportunities are that are critical to success in a modern labor market where mobility is so important. And so the way in which we traditionally overcome market failures is to think about the role of coordinating institutions, to be sure to think about the role of government in providing the right incentives and to providing the resources needed to bring the coordinating institutions, to bring labor organizations, professional associations, and increasingly women's groups and other groups into the process of providing continuing education, providing resources to help people to gain access to the educational development that they need to move successfully through their careers. This, I believe, is the frontier that Korea could lead in this part of the world. I don't think your neighboring countries, with perhaps the exception of Singapore, has been successful in developing this lifelong learning capability by bringing these institutions together and drawing on them. And I think that is a real opportunity. We see this in some of your very innovative programs here in Korea to develop this at a regional level. Last spring I was fortunate to be part of opening a new forum in Daegu, one of your regions which badly needs new economic and human resource development, where you saw bringing industry, leaders of all the educational institutions in the community, leaders of the local government, and leaders of the labor movement in that area together to talk about how can they work on regional economic development. That's the kind of cross-cutting institutions that need to work together if we are going to solve this challenge of lifelong learning. So I think there's a lot we can do to build a knowledge-based workforce, to make sure that it's inclusive, to bring all people into this process, a point I will end on in a few minutes this morning. But we have to go beyond. We have to look at what are the modern institutions that are needed in order to take advantage of a skilled and innovative workforce. And it starts right at the workplace. Korea has had a very successful history of economic development in the last 25 to 30 years. You have achieved an enormous amount, but you are now at that stage of economic development, looking at your neighbors, many of whom are going to be able to outcompete you on the basis of costs, to ask how can we make that shift to a knowledge, more innovation-driven economy. We know how to do this in many respects, but around the world, in the United States, and I suspect and I believe, given the evidence I've seen here in Korea, the pattern is the same. We have many organizations, leading organizations in our industries, such as the organizations, the companies that have participated in this new paradigm initiative, who are investing in their human resources, who are training their workers, who are making sure that they build a workplace where there's high trust so that employees feel that they can use their ideas and their ideas are listened to. We have empowering the workforce by giving them an opportunity to solve problems, to work in joint task forces, and all of the modern systems of work organization and teamwork that we know are so critical and that we have seen in industries as diverse as automobiles, airlines, traditional industries like clothing and steel, and newer emerging industries like biotechnology and software engineering. All of these, we have strong empirical evidence in the United States that where you build this kind of modern high-performance work system that engages the workforce and uses their skills and talent and overcomes our adversarial traditions and some of our authoritarian managerial traditions, we get higher productivity and higher quality and higher service. The most recent evidence of this is in a project that we have been working on in our healthcare industry, where we see that companies like Kaiser Permanente on the West Coast have engaged their workforce in a partnership and have been able to succeed in changing what had been a very low-performing adversarial culture to a high-performance one. Yet, we have to go beyond the leading cases. It's not good enough that just leading organizations, like in our airline industry, in the United States, Southwest Airlines, or like in your country here, Yuhan Kimberly with its efforts and leadership on this particular dimension. It's not good enough just to have leading cases. We need government policies and we need institutions that help to diffuse these. In the United States, we have seen successful diffusion come through private initiatives of foundations like the Sloan Foundation, working with universities, working with industry, and working with labor partners in specific industries. So at MIT, we have an automobile project. We have a pharmaceutical project. In other places like Stanford, it's been the computer project. At Berkeley and the University of California, it's software. And there's focused efforts to bring leaders from these different industries together with academics who are studying, teaching, out in the field, collecting data and analyzing how do we bring technology, human resources, work organization, innovations together to produce high levels of support and high levels of performance. That's the kind of diffusion strategy that I think could be mirrored and modeled here in Korea, not just by private institutions, but by governments facilitating those kinds of collaborative processes. To go beyond, individual organizations. Individual organizations are the starting point. We can't have a strong innovation-based economy unless we have strong innovation-based firms and work systems that support it. But we have to go beyond that. We know that we need a very active labor market policy, and here I think nothing is a bigger challenge nor a bigger opportunity for Korea than to work hard to bring women into the full role that they are capable of playing in your economy. I was delighted to hear this morning that women have won the top honors in 8 different areas of competition in educational achievement and in various competitive exams here in Korea this year. Well, that's a tremendous talent pool. But we all know that in Korea you have a relatively low labor force participation rate of women. You have a very low 1.08 birth rate, fertility rate in the country. And I'm delighted to hear, as in recent visits, that you're now beginning to see this as an economic development challenge, that this is a challenge that we've got to figure out. How do we bring women into the labor force? How do we make sure that work and family are integrated in a way and that we have the supports for women to fulfill their potential? Fulfill their potential by participating in organizations to their fullest extent. That requires that there are effective child support programs, that there are effective educational programs so that it doesn't require so much labor-intensive work on the part of women to provide those supports at home in the labor market. It requires an opportunity then for women to continue to get the training and education as they move in and out of the labor force during child rearing and child bearing years. And finally, it requires a major change in the culture and in the organizational styles in which women are treated in organizations. That's a challenge we all face across the world, and each culture has to address it within your own values, your own traditions, and your own needs. But I believe here in Korea, given the investments that you have made and the talent pool that is available, that this is a tremendous opportunity open to development. I believe it also requires women to take more active roles in building the kind of support networks and the kind of infrastructure that helps them to provide opportunities for each other, to provide information on job opportunities, to provide the kind of support networks needed that we have seen have worked in organizations in the United States and elsewhere. And so this is a major opportunity and a major challenge. There's a debate here in Korea over the numbers about how many people are in non-standard work. Government numbers, I guess, suggest that it's around 38%. Some private economists and other people who have looked at these data carefully put that number well over 50%. Whatever the number, it's a challenge we face in all countries around the world because the small and medium-sized organizations and the growth of immigrants and the growth of other sources of non-standard work are apparent in all of our economies at the moment. This is an issue that I believe requires, like the others I've mentioned, collaboration across institutions. Government can only go so far. Government can enforce basic labor standards and try to overcome the distinction between those who are covered under your basic social safety nets of employment insurance and minimum standards by making sure that that we reach out to the small and medium-sized organizations. But government can only do this so far. It requires reaching out to the growing role of NGOs in our countries and across the world. Across the world, we are seeing more non-governmental organizations. In some cases, affiliated with labor organizations, some cases, ethnic organizations, some cases, just indigenous and non-for-profit organizations. Some of them are very effective, some of them are not. And so we have to be careful in beginning to reach out to these organizations to make sure they are legitimate and they are effective. But they are a resource. We are finding in global supply chains, for example, that organizations like Nike and Adidas and Reebok and others are beginning to work with these organizations to both help in the monitoring process and to help in upgrading the standards and upgrading production processes by educating workers, by working with employers to extend the reach of government policies, to making sure there's transparency in how work is being performed and how minimum standards are being met. That provides them then with a forum and an opportunity to say, well, how do we train these workers? How do we make sure that they are part of the knowledge economy? And how do we bring them into this process of improving economic growth and development? Government can support these kinds of efforts by working with these groups, relying on them, providing the kind of resources to helping to upgrade labor standards for this growing and crucial group in our economy. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't talk a bit about the challenge of labor management relations. Coming from the United States and our adversarial tradition, I'm hardly in a position to say, do what we do in the United States. In fact, I would argue very strongly that we need different models of labor management relations in the U.S., and I spend a good deal of my time working on these kinds of issues in our home country. But here too, you have made tremendous progress since 1987, when you recognized you needed to democratize your labor market and open up opportunities for workers to exercise the basic human right of freedom of choice and freedom of association. Yet you remain in a highly adversarial relationship in many of your organizational settings. You have set up a tripartite commission that has worked very hard to reform your labor laws and bring them into compliance with world accepted standards. And I know those debates continue, but these processes not only have to be inclusive of all the groups that want to participate and that are participating as labor organizations, they have to be complemented with efforts at lower levels. National tripartite forums, national labor law is only the skeleton that provides the basis for moving forward at a regional and at an industry level. The regional forums, bringing labor and management together, workplace councils, which are embedded in your laws but underutilized, are all opportunities for overcoming the adversarial traditions and for working in partnership. We have seen the most progress in the United States in addressing these kinds of issues where we have seen labor and management work together in partnerships. I mentioned an organization like Southwest Airlines. Southwest Airlines is the most highly unionized airline in the United States. But over its long history from 1971 to present, it has worked collaboratively with these organizations representing their workforce. And they work to bring them together not in large, big, formal structures, but in the day-to-day practice of moving people from one place to another efficiently with good cheer and with high quality. Continental Airlines is another example that is doing very similar things and learning from Southwest to make these kinds of partnerships work. In the healthcare sector, we have seen New York hospitals, we have seen Kaiser Permanente as leading examples. We can do this in industry, and we can do this in the service sector if we work on it. So, as we move forward, I think the most important thing to take away from this impressive forum over the last couple of years is that it is possible to develop our economies and to use human resources as a strong comparative advantage and competitive asset. And essentially, it is absolutely essential to do so, given where you are and given the environment in which you are competing with your neighbors. But that requires going beyond the confines of this hall and the people in this room. It means developing a broadly shared vision and a consensus strategy for how to move forward. That means we have to develop more of a collaborative economy, a collaborative strategy where government doesn't try to dictate, but government becomes a catalyst for change, becomes the convening forum that brings people together, that provides resources and incentives for people to collaborate. It means being inclusive, not just the business community, certainly the business community as a starting point, certainly the education community, but also the labor community, and also increasingly reaching out to women and to people in this NGO community that are providing some of the new services necessary for a successful economy. And finally, if we are going to realize this dream, then we have to recognize that today's workforce and today's workplace and today's family life are tightly coupled institutions. We have to think about what is a family-centered labor market policy going to look like? How can we begin to provide the flexibility so people can continue to do a very good job in their workplaces and a very good job as parents and as citizens in their home and community responsibilities? That's what I think it will take to move forward. And if your greatest asset is your willingness to learn from others, as I think you have done so well and so effectively over the years, then perhaps it's time to, I guess we missed the last slide, but the last slide simply says, why not work together to realize the Korean dream that so many of you share and make it a reality for your society. Thank you very much.